And before we sign off today, Coach Chaz and Chaz and I do the review of the tournament. Chaz, look back here on this tournament. You see the top 7 teams: New York, Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, Minnesota, Edmonton, Chicago. Naturally, the favorites in the beginning were Montreal, Vancouver, and New York, the big 3.
Yeah, I find it a real shocker that Vancouver was gone after their first 2 games. They really played some tough teams, but their team just looked very lackluster. They looked like they really didn't want it this year.
So you saw the first 7. Now comment on the next 4. You see New York, Montreal, no surprise there. But Minnesota knocking off last year's finalist Toronto, Coach Brian, and Edmonton sneaking knock off Chicago, who last year got the finals with, of course, Coach Allen. And the bottom 3 in the loser bracket. You comment on the next phase, too.
Well, this year I don't think Chicago was the same team. They didn't. Of course, Al defected. He got the raise and went to Montreal. Edmonton, I had my eye on them from the beginning. They were the number 6 seed, but you looked at them and you said, well, they got something that you like. They got that tough defense. Minnesota, they were somewhat of an unknown coming to this tournament. No one really knew how good they were. Again, the number 5 seed, who went all the way until their loss to New York, and they played 2 really good games.
Now, you look at phase 3. Montreal was beaten by New York. Minnesota beat Edmonton. So you have New York and Montreal still undefeated, with Montreal, Edmonton, Vancouver, and Toronto in the loser bracket. Chicago already eliminated. So you had New York, Minnesota, the only 2 undefeated teams. Kind of shocked the world with Montreal, Edmonton, Vancouver, and Toronto in phase number 3.
Yeah, you did, and again, Minnesota beating Edmonton that time out. And I think Minnesota might have showed Edmonton a little too many of their tricks in that game, which enabled Edmonton to beat them later on in the semifinal game.
Now, phase 4, of course, these would be the seedings going into phase number 5. New York seed number 1 after beating Minnesota, Montreal, Edmonton, and Toronto. Now, Toronto defeated last year's champions, eliminated them in the 3rd round.
Yes, they did, and Toronto was still hanging tough, even though I believe they lost their opening game. Did they not?
Yes, they did.
But they still had the talent, and they were still had to be a force to be reckoned with. And of course, Edmonton and Minnesota, the 2 sleeper teams, really, after the first 4 phases.
Now, you view the final team. New York was semifinalists last year. Minnesota was even in there. Montreal neither was. Edmonton last year goes by Coach Brian to the Final 4, and this year Brian taking Toronto. So Edmonton and Toronto played a consolation game. Edmonton has crushed them 21-1. So, set up the Final 4. Coach Brian out, but his team from last year is still there in the Final 4. New York, number 1 seed. Minnesota, number 2. Montreal, Edmonton in that big showdown, that 7-6 barn burner. Before that game, though, you review the Final 4. Who would you pick to get the finals here, based on this thing right here?
My original picks were New York and Montreal. I figured those were the 2 best teams there. And I find it was a total shock when Edmonton upset Montreal.
So now we go to phase number 6. Edmonton, that dramatic 7-6 win, played Minnesota, and New York waiting to balance. And you see Edmonton completely dominated that game. Even though Minnesota played well, the power play just hurt them, and they won 9-5. So you view the Final 3, phase number 6, the 3 teams there, and finally we set up the championship game.
Well, of course, New York was well rested for the final game. They had the automatic bye into the finals. Minnesota against Edmonton. Minnesota, the power play had been an Achilles heel the whole tournament. They were just able to deal with it in the first 5 phases. But they were playing too good a team in Edmonton to let it. When you give up, I believe it was 4 or 5, 3, somewhere near between 3 and 5 shorthanded goals, you just can't let that happen. You have to take advantage of the power play.
And finally, a championship game. New York, Edmonton. Who would ever pick Edmonton to be in there? Coach Mike, first year in there. Losing 10-6, but I think Edmonton showed 2nd year in a row being the Final 4. And I think they showed, look out for next year because they may be back.
I believe Edmonton has everything there, a mixture of young talent and the veterans to repeat and the defense. But I think they can probably get there again next year, and they may be the team to watch in next year's tournament.
Well, Coach Chaz, it's been a pleasure for CBS Sports to cover the championship. Last year, Vancouver dramatically in double overtime. This year, no doubt about it. The most dramatic games there were coming from behind when Coach Chaz from Minnesota and won that shot with 45 seconds. So that's what we picked. We sat down together, the whole staff picked. So here it is. Game number 3, dramatics. Chaz beating Toronto 8-7. Game number 2 had to be when Brad had the chance to win it with 25 seconds, but the goalie made the save. With Chicago finally knocked out by Toronto. And of course, dramatic game number 1. Last game we saw, Montreal, Edmonton. Edmonton hanging on for 10 minutes, a pure onslaught to keep the 1-goal victory. Your comment, our 3 picks for best games.
I think definitely the best game was the Edmonton-Montreal game. Edmonton's defense was just too tough in the last 10 minutes, not allowing a goal. And, you got to give their defense credit, and their goalie played a whale-of game that game.
Of course, the biggest blowout had to be Edmonton-Chicago, 19-7 record.
Yeah, yes, it was. And Chicago, I really don't think I don't think their heart was in it this year. They didn't have their coach. I don't think they felt comfortable with the coach that they had this year. Some of the players were grumbling earlier in the season about him, and I just don't think there was a good chemistry on that team.
What's the future of Vancouver and Coach Bob? After winning it all last year, then getting out of the third round, what happens to them? Is he in a bubble, or we come back and be a force?
Well, Coach Bob had some personal problems with his female companion coming into the tournament, and I think that kind of weighed heavy on him and his team's performance.
Well, it's been a great hockey tournament. It's time to go, but for Chaz and Al, take care, everybody. We'll see you next year in New York Champions, and we'll see you all in 91. For CBS Sports, I'm Al Albert. Good night and good evening.
And I'm Chaz Cosell saying, have a good year.